He was repairing an orc girl's armor. Then she whispered, "Go ahead." The words were a ghost of a sound, barely more than the hiss of cooling metal in the slack tub, but they hung in the forge's grimy air like a death sentence. He had just finished giving her soup, watching her drink it down with a desperate animal hunger that spoke of days spent running. Now he was looking at the ruin of her pauldron, and she was watching him. The rain had been a solid wall for 3 days, turning the path to his forge into a black sludge that swallowed boots whole. Cale did not mind. The rain kept travellers away, and travellers meant questions. He'd had enough questions for one lifetime. He preferred the steady rhythm of his hammer, the roar of the bellows, and the lonely quiet of the mountains. His life was a small, tightly wound thing, and he guarded its perimeter with a silence that most people found unnerving. It was a simple existence, built on the foundations of sweat and soot and the deep ache of old grief. That night, the storm had clawed at his roof with a special fury. Wind howled through the gaps in the stone walls, making the fire in the hearth dance like a frantic ghost. He was banking the coals for the night when a sound cut through the gale, a heavy, scraping thud against his door. It was not the sound of a branch. It was the sound of a body. Caution was a lesson Cale had learned in blood and failure. He took a heavy iron poker from the hearth, its tip still glowing a faint cherry red, and moved toward the door. He did not call out. There was no one to hear him for 20 miles, and whatever was on the other side of that oak plank was not looking for a conversation. He slid the bolt, cracked the door an inch, and peered into the maelstrom. She was slumped against the frame, a mountain of dark green skin, black leather, and matted hair. An orc, a female by the look of her, though it was hard to tell beneath the mud and the blood. One hand was still clenched around the hilt of a brutal-looking axe, the head of which was buried in the mud beside her. Her breathing was a ragged, painful rasp. In the brief flash of lightning that followed, he saw the fletching of 3 arrows sticking out of her back and shoulder, their shafts snapped short. He also saw the flicker of torchlight far down the mountain pass, a swarm of angry fireflies dancing in the deluge. Hunted, every instinct screamed at him to slam the door, shoot the bolt, and pretend he had seen nothing. This was not his fight. He had left the world of fights and failures behind. His forge was a sanctuary from all that, a place of creation, not conflict. Helping her would invite whatever hunted her right to his doorstep. It would shatter the fragile peace he had so carefully constructed. He looked from the unconscious orc to the distant torches. They were getting closer, moving with a grim purpose. He thought of the empty cot in the corner, the spare blanket, the pot of stew still warm by the fire. He thought of another rainy night long ago, and a door he had not opened fast enough. With a curse that was swallowed by the wind, Cale hooked his arms under hers and dragged her inside. She was heavier than a block of granite, all dense muscle and bone. He kicked the door shut against the storm, the bolt sliding home with a sound of finality. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind, the fire, and her laboured breathing on his floor. He had just invited the world and all its violence back into his life. He did not yet know that it was the first decision he had made in a decade that truly mattered. She lay on the packed dirt floor of his forge, a broken piece of the storm washed up at his hearth. Cale stood over her, the poker still in his hand, its glow faded to black. The smell of wet pine, cold mud, and the sharp bite of wood smoke filled the small space, now joined by the coppery tang of her blood. It soaked through the back of her leather tunic, pooling in a dark stain on the floor. He was not a healer. He was a smith. He knew how to mend iron, not flesh. But he also knew that if he did not get those arrowheads out, she would die. Sepsis or blood loss would take her before the hunters ever could. He looked at the hard line of her jaw, the slight flare of her nostrils with each pained breath, the tusks that jutted from her lower lip, smaller and sharper than a male's. She was young for an orc, maybe not much older than 20 winters, too young to be hunted down like a dog in the mountains. His jaw tightened. He had made his choice at the door. Now he had to see it through. He set the poker aside and stoked the fire in the hearth, adding logs until it blazed hot and bright. He put a small kettle of water on to boil and laid out his tools on a clean rag, a sharp skinning knife, a pair of flat-nosed pliers he used for fine wire work, and a flask of the harsh, grain-distilled spirit he kept for cold nights. It was a poor surgeon's kit, but it was all he had. The first challenge was the armour. It was a complex puzzle of hardened leather plates, iron buckles and fur linings, all slick with rain and blood. He started with the straps on her uninjured side, his fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar clasps. As his hands moved over her, her eyes snapped open. They were the colour of molten gold, and they burned with a feverish, feral light. Her hand shot up and locked around his wrist. Her grip was like an iron vice, fast, brutal, even while dying. She could break his arm without effort. He froze, his own hand hovering over a buckle on her chest. "What are you doing?" she rasped, the words a gravelly sound torn from her throat. It was the common tongue, spoken with a thick, guttural accent. Cale kept his voice low and steady, the same tone he used to soothe a spooked horse. "The arrows, they need to come out." He did not try to pull away. That would be a fool's move. He simply met her gaze, letting her see the lack of threat in his eyes. She stared at him, her golden eyes searching his face, looking for the lie, the weakness, the angle. He could feel the tremor in her arm, the strain of holding on. She was bleeding out on his floor, yet her pride was a shield as strong as any steel. "The hunters?" she asked, her voice weaker now. "Still on the mountain," he said. "The storm will slow them, but not for long." Her grip loosened slightly. The internal war was plain on her face, the instinct to trust no one against the cold, hard reality of her situation. She needed help. He was the only help available. "Why?" she whispered, the single word holding a universe of suspicion. Why help an orc? Why risk his life for a stranger, an enemy to his kind? Cale thought of the empty cot, the quiet years. He thought of the torches in the rain. "Because you were at my door," he said, as if that explained everything. To him, it did. Her gaze held his for a long moment longer, then her hand fell away, slumping to the floor. Her eyes drifted shut. It was not trust. It was exhaustion. It was a surrender to the inevitable, one way or another. He took it as permission. Working quickly now, he managed the rest of the buckles and eased the heavy armor off her torso. Beneath it, she wore a simple linen tunic, now soaked and stained crimson. He took his skinning knife and carefully cut the fabric away from the wounds. There were 2 arrows lodged in the thick muscle of her back, and a third that had punched clean through the pauldron and into her shoulder. None looked to have hit anything vital, but they were deep. He sterilized the knife and pliers in the boiling water, and then with the green spirit. Taking a deep breath, he knelt beside her. "This will hurt," he said to the unconscious woman. He pressed down on the skin around the first arrowhead, gripped the broken shaft with the pliers, and pulled. She screamed, a raw, choked sound, and her whole body arched off the floor. Her eyes flew open, blind with agony, but she did not fight him. He dropped the bloody shaft and arrowhead into a bowl and moved to the next one without pausing. He worked with the grim efficiency of a man dismantling a broken machine. There was no room for sympathy, only the task at hand. The third arrow, the one in her shoulder, was the worst. It had gone through leather and iron before finding flesh. He had to cut the head out, his knife tracing a bloody path. Her breath hitched and sobbed, but she made no other sound. When it was done, she was limp, her skin pale beneath its green hue. He cleaned the wounds as best he could with the hot water and harsh spirit, then packed them with a poultice of yarrow and moss he kept for burns and cuts. He did not have bandages, so he tore strips from one of his own clean shirts and bound her wounds tightly. He managed to haul her onto the cot, her dead weight a staggering burden. He covered her with his thickest wool blanket and then stood back, breathing heavily. The forge was a wreck. Blood and muddy water stained the floor. Her ruined armor lay in a heap. The air was thick with the smell of pain. He cleaned up, moving with methodical purpose. He scrubbed the floor, washed his tools, and threw the bloody rags into the fire. He set her armor aside near the hearth to dry. A piece of it, the pauldron, was nearly sheared in 2. A heavy blade had struck it, a blow that would have taken her arm off without the steel. He ran his thumb over the deep gouge. It was shoddy work, that pauldron. The plates were poorly balanced, the steel improperly tempered. He could do better. He turned his attention back to the fire, ladling some of the thick vegetable and barley stew into a wooden bowl. He did not know if she would wake, but if she did, she would need food. He set the bowl on the floor by the cot and sat down in his worn wooden chair, watching her. The storm still raged outside, but in the small, firelit forge, a new and dangerous quiet had settled. He had crossed a line. There was no going back. He simply waited for the consequences to arrive. She woke near dawn. The storm had broken, and a pale, watery light filtered through the grimy window high on the forge wall. Cale had not slept. He had spent the night watching her and watching the pass. The torches had vanished hours ago, likely having given up in the face of the storm. For now, they were safe. He saw the moment consciousness returned. Her breathing deepened, and a flicker of awareness passed behind her eyelids. She did not move, did not open her eyes. Kale had seen the same trick in cornered animals. She was listening, sensing, assessing her situation before revealing she was awake. He remained silent in his chair, letting her have the advantage. Finally, her eyes opened. They were no longer clouded with fever, but sharp and clear. They scanned the ceiling, the stone walls, the neatly stacked tools of his trade, and finally they settled on him. There was no gratitude in her gaze, only a cold, hard evaluation. "You are a smith," she stated. It was not a question. "I am," he confirmed. She pushed herself up, a grimace of pain tightening her features. She swung her legs over the side of the cot and sat there, the blanket pooled around her waist. The linen strips he had used for bandages were stark white against her green skin. She looked at them, then back at him. "You did this?" "I did." He expected a thank you. He did not get one. Instead, she looked at the bowl of stew on the floor, now cold. Her stomach rumbled, a low, embarrassing growl in the quiet room. Kale stood, took the bowl, and added a ladle of hot broth from the pot still simmering by the fire. He handed it to her without a word. She took it, her eyes never leaving his. She sniffed it, her nostrils flaring. Suspicion radiated from her like heat from the forge. She thought it was poisoned. The thought was so absurd it was almost funny. Lady, if he had wanted her dead, he would have left her in the rain. He saw the challenge in her eyes. It was a test. He walked back to the hearth, picked up his own bowl from the night before, and ladled some of the same stew into it. He sat back down in his chair, met her gaze, and took a slow, deliberate spoonful. He chewed the soft barley and turnip, then swallowed. He watched as the tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. It was enough. She lifted the bowl to her lips and drank, not bothering with the spoon he had left for her. She finished it in a few long, desperate swallows, the sound raw and hungry. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and held the empty bowl out to him. It was not a request. It was a demand. He refilled it for her. She finished the second bowl as quickly as the first. The food seemed to bring a little life back into her, a spark of colour returning to her pale skin. She set the empty bowl down and finally looked at the mangled pauldron lying near the hearth. "My armour," she said, her voice stronger now. "It's damaged," he said. "The steel is brittle, poorly quenched." Her eyes narrowed. "It was made by a master of my clan." "Then your master is lazy," Kale replied, his voice flat. He was on solid ground here. He knew metal. He walked over, picked up the pauldron and brought it to her. He pointed to the crystalline fracture in the steel where the blade had struck. "See? The grain is too large. He heated it too high, too fast. It's strong, but it shatters. Good steel should bend before it breaks." She looked from the broken plate to his face. She saw no arrogance there, only the simple statement of a fact. He was not criticizing her clan. He was diagnosing a flaw in a piece of metal. This she seemed to understand. He took the pauldron back to his anvil. He gestured toward it. "I can fix it, make it better." She watched him, her golden eyes unreadable. He could feel her weighing him, measuring his worth, his intentions. The silence stretched, filled only by the drip of water from the eaves and the soft sigh of the fire. He was mending the armor of an orc who was being hunted by unknown enemies. He had given her food and tended her wounds. Now he was offering to repair the very thing that protected her. He was tying his fate to hers, knot by knot. He was repairing an orc girl's armor. Then she whispered, "Go ahead." The words were a dare, a warning, permission, and a threat, all wrapped in one. Go ahead and fix it. Go ahead and try to trick me. Go ahead and prove yourself. He looked at her, sitting on his cot, wounded and cornered, but radiating a power that had nothing to do with physical strength. It was the innate authority of a leader, a warrior, a chieftain. He suddenly felt like he was standing before a queen. He gave a slow, single nod. He did not need to say anything else. He turned to the forge, picked up his hammer, and went to work. The fragile thaw had begun, not with warmth, but with the cold, hard ring of steel on steel. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Kale worked, the orc healed. Her name, he learned, was Grusha. She offered it one afternoon as she watched him draw out a bar of white-hot steel, her voice low and grudging, as if the word itself was a valuable coin she was reluctant to spend. He offered his own in return. Kale. It sounded small and plain next to hers. He worked on her pauldron first, not just repairing it, but remaking it. He broke down the flawed plates, reforged them in his own fire, and quenched them with a practiced hand, watching the colors run across the cooling steel like an oil slick on water. He knew the precise moment to pull the metal, the instant it achieved the perfect balance of hardness and flexibility. It was a knowledge born of 1,000 repetitions, a language spoken between man and iron. Grusha watched him for hours on end, her silence a heavy presence in the forge. She sat on a stool he had given her, her back straight despite her healing wounds, her hands resting on her knees. Her gaze was intense, analytical. She was not just watching a smith at work, she was studying a process, memorizing the dance of hammer and tongs, the flow of heat and force. He had the unsettling feeling that she was learning his craft simply by observing it. On the third day, he woke to find the wood box next to the hearth, which had been nearly empty, was now overflowing with freshly split logs. They were stacked with a neat geometric precision. He looked outside and saw that one of his larger chopping blocks had been split clean in two. His felling axe, which he'd left embedded in the block, was now cleaned and propped against the forge wall. He looked at Grusha, who was sitting in her usual spot, staring into the fire. She did not acknowledge him, but a faint dark flush on her high cheekbones told him all he needed to know. She was in his debt, and her pride demanded she contribute. It was a payment made not in coin, but in labor. The next morning, she was up before him, coaxing the embers in the hearth back to life. When he rose, a small fire was already burning, taking the chill from the morning air. It was a simple, practical gesture, but it felt significant. It was the first act she had performed that was for his comfort, not just to balance a perceived debt. He grunted a quiet thanks, and she responded with a barely perceptible nod. Their conversations were sparse, utilitarian things. More wood, The water needs boiling. Hand me the hammer. Yet, in the shared silence, a strange sort of understanding began to grow. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her posture, the tightening of her jaw that meant her wounds were aching, the slight widening of her eyes when he executed a particularly difficult fold in the steel. In turn, she seemed to be learning him. She began to anticipate his needs, having a tool ready before he asked for it, or moving a stack of iron bars out of his way as he worked. They moved around the small space of the forge with an increasing, unspoken choreography, two solitary creatures learning the steps to a dance they had not known they were a part of. One evening, as he was putting the finishing touches on her repaired pauldron, she spoke into the quiet. "You are skilled," she said, her voice flat with observation. "You do not work like a village smith. Your hands are sure. You waste no motion." Cale did not look up from the leather strap he was conditioning. "I had a good teacher." "And where is this teacher now?" The question hung in the air. Cale's hands stilled. He thought of Master Borin, a man with hands like leather aprons and a laugh like grinding stones. He thought of the fire, the screams, the raid that had come out of the northern hills. He had been an apprentice then, barely a man. He'd been sent to the well for water. When he returned, the forge was an inferno, and Borin was dead, a raider's spear in his chest. Cale had hidden in the woods until they were gone. He had survived. His master had not. The guilt was an old, familiar weight. "He died," Cale said, his voice tight. "A long time ago." Grusha was silent for a moment. He could feel her eyes on him, her unnerving, intelligent gaze. "You were a warrior once," she stated. It was not a question. He flinched. "No." The word was too sharp, too fast. "You move like one," she insisted. "Quiet. You watch the tree line. You sleep with a poker by your hand. You are no simple smith." "I was a town guard," he corrected her, his voice low. "For a season. It was a mistake." He did not elaborate. He did not speak of the merchant's daughter, the bandits, his hesitation. He did not speak of the funeral, the accusing eyes of the townspeople, the shame that had driven him from the town and up into these lonely mountains. To his surprise, she did not press him. Instead, she offered a piece of her own story, a small chipped stone in return for his. "My clan follows the old code," she said, her gaze distant, fixed on the dancing flames. "Strength is law. The weak are culled. My father was chieftain. He believed strength was more than just the axe arm. He believed in wisdom, in foresight." She paused, her hand unconsciously straying to the hilt of the axe that now leaned against the wall by her cot. "Others did not agree. My uncle, Gorok, he believes in the axe arm and nothing more. He challenged my father. He won." The simple words were delivered without emotion, but they carried the weight of a kingdom's fall. Betrayal, a usurper. It explained the hunt, the desperation. She was not just a fugitive. She was a deposed heir. "My father told me to run," she continued, her voice a low murmur, "to gather those still loyal. He said our clan was a forge, and Gorok's rule was a fire burning too hot. It would make the steel brittle. He told me to find a new way, a stronger way." She looked at him then, her golden eyes holding his. "He was killed before I could escape the hold. Gorok wants me dead. He wants my sisters dead. He wants the idea of my father erased from the world. Cale felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was far worse than he had imagined. This was not a simple criminal on the run. This was a civil war, and he was standing right in the middle of it. He felt the familiar urge to retreat, to push it all away, to tell her she had to leave. But then he looked at her. He saw the grief she held so tightly in check, the immense burden of her father's legacy, the weight of her people's future. He saw a strength that went far beyond the axe arm she was so quick to rely on. It was the strength of endurance, the strength of purpose. It was a strength he recognized because he had once tried and failed to have it himself. Later that night, he was awakened by a muffled sound from her cot, a choked sob. He lay still, listening. She was dreaming, thrashing in the throes of a nightmare, her hands clenched, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He heard his master's name whispered in the dark, a desperate, broken plea. No, that was not right. It was her own father's name, in her own tongue. He rose quietly and went to her. In the faint moonlight, he could see tears tracking paths through the grime on her cheeks. She was trapped in the memory of her father's fall. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment, then gently rested it on her uninjured shoulder. She did not wake, but the thrashing stopped. The frantic tension seemed to drain out of her. She let out a long, shuddering breath and settled into a deeper, more peaceful sleep. He stood there for a long time, his hand on her shoulder, a silent, unmoving guardian in the dark. He felt a strange, protective instinct rise in him, something he had not felt in a very long time. He carefully pulled the rough wool blanket up to her chin, tucking it around her. It was a small, vulnerable gesture, an act of care given with no expectation of return. As he turned to go back to his own cold bedroll, he felt a profound and terrifying shift inside him. His quiet, empty world had been invaded, and he was no longer sure he wanted it back. The forge was no longer just his sanctuary. It had become hers, too. The thaw, fragile as it was shattered by the discovery of the carving. Cale found it on the 4th morning after Grusha's arrival. He had gone to check his snare lines in the woods behind the forge, a routine he had performed 1,000 times, but this time something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. The usual chatter of birds was gone, replaced by an expectant silence. He moved with a new caution, his senses on high alert, a change Grusha had noticed in him. There, carved into the trunk of a great oak that marked the edge of his territory, was a symbol. It was a jagged, stylized eye, hacked into the bark with a heavy blade. It was fresh, the wood beneath still pale and weeping sap. He had never seen the mark before, but he knew what it was. A scout's sign, a marker. We are here. We have found you. He backed away slowly, his hand resting on the handle of the small hatchet at his belt. He scanned the dense undergrowth, the dark spaces between the trees. He saw nothing, but he felt them. He felt the eyes on him. They were close. The reprieve the storm had granted them was over. He returned to the forge, his steps quick and silent. He did not need to say a word. Grusha saw it on his face. She was on her feet instantly, her hand going to her axe. "What is it?" she demanded, her voice a low growl. A mark on the oak by the snare line. An eye. A muscle in her jaw jumped. Gorok's eye. His outriders. They are trackers, the best. She moved to the door, peering out through a crack in the frame. How many? I saw no one, but they are out there. They are watching. The quiet domesticity of the past few days evaporated like water on hot steel. The forge was no longer a workshop. It was a fortress, and a poorly defended one at that. The air grew thick with tension, a shared, unspoken fear. They were trapped. Her hunters had found their prey, and his sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. "Your work," she said, turning from the door, her eyes blazing with a new urgency. "The pauldron, is it finished?" Almost. He had been taking his time, enjoying the process, the challenge of it. Now, time was a luxury they no longer had. He went to the anvil, his movements economical and swift. He worked the final rivets, his hammer blows falling with a frantic, percussive rhythm. Grusha stood guard, her axe in her hand, her body poised like a coiled spring. She watched the woods, her head tilted, listening for the snap of a twig, the rustle of a leaf that was out of place. "They will not come in force at first," she said, her voice tight. "They will send a small group to test the defenses, to confirm it is me." "There are no defenses," Cale said grimly, hammering a rivet flat. "Just a stone wall and a wooden door." "And us," she added. There was no bravado in her voice. It was a simple statement of fact. He finished the pauldron and brought it to her. He had remade it completely. The steel was a dark, burnished gray, oiled to a dull sheen. The leather straps were new and supple. It was heavier than her old one, but better balanced. It was his finest work. She took it from him, her fingers tracing the smooth, curved lines of the metal. She ran her thumb over the edge. It was an expert's appraisal. "Good," she grunted. It was the highest praise he could have hoped for. He helped her buckle it on, his fingers brushing against her skin. The simple act, which had been fraught with tension just days ago, now felt different. It was practical, necessary. A quiet moment of preparation for the violence to come. Her skin was warm. He tried not to notice. They did not have to wait long. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, they came. 3 of them. They moved out of the trees like shadows, large, hulking shapes armed with crude axes and heavy crossbows. They were not the disciplined trackers Grusha had described. These were thugs. Gorok's blunt instruments. They fanned out, approaching the forge from 3 sides. One of them, the largest, strode toward the front door. He carried a massive 2-handed axe. He stopped about 20 yards out and bellowed, his voice a guttural roar. "The female! Gorok demands her. Send her out, and the little man lives." Cale's hand tightened on the handle of his heaviest forging hammer. It was not a weapon, but it would split a helm as easily as it would split a log. Grusha looked at him. Her eyes were chips of gold in the dim light. "Stay away from the door," she commanded. "They will try to draw you out." "What's the plan?" he asked, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. "The one in the front is the leader," she said, her gaze flicking between the 3 orcs. "He is arrogant. He will come to the door. The one on the left has a crossbow. He is the real threat. You will deal with him." He stared at her. "Deal with him? With what? I'm a smith. You are a smith, she agreed, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. Your forge is your weapon. Use it. Before he could ask what she meant, she moved. She unbarred the door, kicked it open, and stood silhouetted in the doorway, her own axe held loosely in one hand. It was a direct, arrogant challenge. The leader grinned, showing a row of yellow, broken teeth. There you are, whelp. Your father's pride brought you low.
Come out and die with honor.
My father had honor Garok's dog, Grusha shot back, her voice ringing across the clearing like iron breaking. You are just a butcher. The insult hit its mark. The big orc roared in fury and charged. It was exactly what she wanted. As he thundered toward the door, the orc with the crossbow raised his weapon, aiming for Grusha, who was now a clear target. Now! She yelled. Kale did not hesitate. He grabbed the long-handled tongs he used for pulling crucibles from the fire. In the hearth, a bar of iron he had been working on earlier lay glowing, a brilliant, blinding orange-white. He snatched it up. It was over a yard long and radiated a heat so intense it scorched the air. He moved to the forge's side window, a narrow slit in the stone just wide enough for ventilation. It was directly across from the crossbowman. The orc was focused entirely on Grusha, his finger tightening on the trigger.
Kale shoved the glowing bar of iron through the slit, a spear of pure heat and light. The orc screamed as the white-hot tip touched his arm. It was not a deep wound, but the shock and agony were absolute. His flesh sizzled, and the smell of cooked meat filled the air. He dropped the crossbow and staggered back, clutching his ruined arm, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. At the same moment, the charging leader reached the doorway. Grusha did not meet his charge head-on. That would be suicide. Instead, she sidestepped like a dancer, letting his momentum carry him past her and into the forge. He stumbled, unready for the sudden shift, and she brought the butt of her axe handle down hard on the back of his knee. There was a wet, cracking sound. The big orc bellowed in pain and collapsed, his leg bending at an unnatural angle. He was crippled. The third orc, seeing his leader fall and his companions screaming, faltered. He was just a thug, not a warrior. His nerve broke. He turned and fled back into the woods. It was over in seconds. Inside the forge, the crippled leader tried to push himself up, snarling like a wounded beast. Grusha calmly walked over, placed the blade of her axe against his throat, and looked at Kale. He will not talk, she said. Garok's men fear him more than they fear death. Kale looked at the orc, who spat a gob of black blood onto the floor and glared at him with pure hatred. He then looked at the crossbow lying in the mud outside and the dark shape of the other orc disappearing into the trees. This was just the first wave, the test. They had passed, but in doing so they had confirmed everything. The next wave would not be 3 thugs, it would be an army. He walked over and picked up the fallen crossbow. It was heavy, crudely made, but effective. He checked the mechanism. He understood how it worked. He looked at Grusha, the dying orc at her feet, and the coming darkness. We need to prepare, he said. His voice was steady. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut. But something else was there too. A grim resolve. His quiet world was already destroyed. Now, all that was left was to fight for the new one. The hours after the attack were a blur of grim preparation. Grusha dispatched the crippled scout with a swift, brutal efficiency that left Kale's stomach churning. There was no ceremony, no malice. It was a necessity, like putting down a rabid dog. She dragged the body into the woods, away from the forge, then returned,
her face a stone mask. "They will be back by morning," she said, wiping her bloody axe on a handful of leaves. "Gorok will not take this failure lightly. He will come himself." The name hung in the air between them. Gorok, the usurper, the uncle who had murdered her father. This was no longer just a hunt. It was a final confrontation, and Kale's forge was the chosen ground. "We can't stay here," Kale said, his voice raw. "We can run, head east into the lowlands. They'd never find us in the cities."
Grusha shook her head, her dark hair swinging.
"No, I have run far enough."
She looked around the forge, at the tools, the anvil, the hearth.
"This is good ground, stone walls, a single approach. We can hold them here." "Hold them?" Kale stared at her. "Hold an orc war party. There are 2 of us. You're still wounded, and I'm a blacksmith." "You are more than that," she said, her golden eyes boring into his. "I saw you. You did not freeze. You acted. You used what you had." She gestured to the forge. "This is your weapon, your fire, your iron. We will use it." He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her she was insane. But as he looked at the stubborn set of her jaw, the unshakable certainty in her eyes, he knew it was useless. She would not run. Her stand was here. And if he was honest with himself, a part of him, a part he had thought long dead, did not want to run either. But as the reality of their situation sank in, a cold, bitter resentment began to fester. He looked at her, this chieftain's daughter who had brought a war to his door. He had taken her in, healed her, fed her, armed her, and his reward was to die defending her in a battle that was not his. He had been a fool, a soft-hearted idiot. He had let his old ghosts trick him into this. The fragile trust they had built, the quiet understanding, began to crumble under the weight of his fear and anger. She was a high-status leader, a warrior noble. He was a common smith, a nobody who had run from his own small life. She had used him, used his forge, his skill, his kindness. Their connection, he thought with a surge of bitterness, was a lie. She saw him as a tool, a convenience, a useful little man. Just then a new sound came from the woods. Not the sound of an army, but of a single person running hard. Grusha was instantly alert, her axe in hand. Kale grabbed his hammer. They stood back to back, watching the darkness. A figure stumbled into the clearing. It was another orc female, smaller than Grusha, clad in torn leathers and breathing in ragged sobs. She had a deep gash on her arm, and her face was streaked with tears and dirt. "Urka!" Grusha cried out, her voice filled with a sudden, raw emotion Kale had never heard before. She rushed forward and caught the newcomer as she collapsed. "They are coming, my lady," Urka gasped, clutching at Grusha's arm. "All of them. Gorok leads them. He found the others. Your sisters." She broke down, her words lost in a torrent of grief. "They are all gone." Grusha went rigid. The stone mask she wore cracked, and for a single terrible moment Kale saw the true depth of her loss. Her shoulders slumped, and a sound of pure agony escaped her lips. Her entire family, her loyal followers, her sisters, all slaughtered. She was truly alone now. except for him.
And in that moment, as he watched her cradle her last remaining retainer, his bitterness and resentment washed away, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. This was not a lie. Her pain was real. Her fight was real. She had not used him. She had trusted him. She had come to him, wounded and desperate, and he had given her sanctuary. That was the truth of it. All the rest was just fear talking. Suddenly, from the ridgeline above the forge, a horn blew. It was a deep, ugly sound, full of menace and hate. It was answered by another, and then another, until the whole valley echoed with the sound of their doom. Torches bloomed in the darkness, a constellation of vengeful stars descending upon them. The final siege had begun. Gorok did not bother with subtlety. He sent his warriors in a wave, a howling tide of green skin and crude iron. They crashed against the forge, their axes and swords ringing against the stone walls. Arrows thudded into the heavy oak door, the air filled with their war cries. Inside, Kale and Grusha worked in a frantic, desperate harmony. They had barred the door with a heavy iron beam from Kale's stock. He had heated every poker, every bar of scrap iron, every tool he could spare in the roaring fire. Grusha stood by the door, listening to the chaos outside, calling out warnings. "Left window, 2 of them!" Kale would snatch a glowing bar with his tongs and thrust it through the narrow slit, driving the attackers back with screams of burned flesh. He fed the fire, his face black with soot, his arms aching. The forge had become the heart of their defense, its fire their only real weapon. They tried the roof, clambering up the stone walls. Grusha was there, her axe a whirlwind of death in the darkness, sending bodies tumbling back to the ground. She fought with a cold, silent fury, her grief channeled into a deadly dance. Kale, meanwhile, used his knowledge of the structure, knocking loose stones from the eaves onto the climbers below. But there were too many. For every one they drove back, 2 more took their place. The door began to splinter under the assault of a heavy ram. The walls would hold, but the door would not. It was then that Gorok himself appeared. He was immense, a giant of an orc clad in black iron armor, a huge, jagged sword in his hand. He shoved his warriors aside and strode to the front, the ram falling silent at his approach. "Grusha," his voice boomed, easily penetrating the failing door. "You hide behind a human's walls. You shame our blood. Your father was a weak fool, and you are his weak daughter. Face me." The door groaned, its hinges screaming. It was about to give way. Grusha looked at Kale. Her face was grim, her knuckles white where she gripped her axe. "This is the end," she said, her voice quiet in the chaos. "No," Kale said. He looked at the roaring fire, at the tools of his trade, at her. An idea born of desperation and fire took shape in his mind. "Buy me a minute." She did not question him. She nodded, braced herself against the wall, and prepared for the final charge. Kale worked faster than he ever had in his life. He grabbed the largest crucible, a heavy clay pot he used for melting bronze, and filled it with every piece of scrap lead he had, old weights, fishing sinkers, bits of flashing. He thrust it deep into the heart of the forge fire, pumping the bellows with a mad desperation. The lead melted almost instantly, turning into a shimmering silver pool of liquid death. The door burst inwards with a scream of tortured wood and iron. Garok stood there, framed by the night, his warriors pouring in around him. Grusha met them, her axe singing. She was a storm of fury, but she was only one. Garok ignored her. His eyes, small and cruel, were fixed on Kale. "The little man," he sneered. "This is what you rely on? A soft pink thing that plays with fire?" Kale, using a heavy set of tongs, lifted the crucible from the forge. The heat was immense, blistering his face. He staggered under its weight. "Kale!" Grusha screamed as a warrior's axe caught her in the side, sending her stumbling back. Garok laughed and started toward Kale, raising his great sword. "I will melt you down with your own fire, smith." Kale did not wait for him. With a final desperate heave, he swung the crucible in a wide arc. A wave of molten lead flew through the air. It was not aimed at Garok. It was aimed at the floor in front of him. The liquid metal hit the damp, packed earth floor and exploded. It was a trick old smelters knew. When molten lead hits a wet surface, the water flashes to steam with catastrophic force, spraying the metal everywhere. The forge erupted in a shower of burning silver droplets. The orcs screamed as the molten metal rained down on them, sticking to their skin, their clothes, their eyes. The pain was unimaginable. Garok himself roared in agony as a dozen fiery flecks struck his face and arms, blinding him in one eye. The charge broke. The warriors scrambled back, trampling each other to escape the fiery rain. In the chaos, Grusha surged forward. She ignored the lesser warriors and went straight for her uncle. Blinded and screaming, he swung his sword wildly. She ducked under the clumsy blow, and with all her strength, she drove the spike on the back of her axe head through the gorget of his black armor. There was a sickening crunch of metal and bone. Garok froze, a look of shocked surprise on his ruined face. He dropped his sword, clawed at the axe embedded in his throat, and then collapsed. Silence fell. The remaining warriors stared at their fallen chieftain, then at Grusha, who stood panting over his body, and then at Kale, who stood amidst the carnage, his face grim, the empty crucible still in his hands. Grusha pulled her axe free and stood tall, her form silhouetted against the fire. She looked at the terrified warriors, her own face a mask of grief and fury. Then she did something Kale never expected. She turned to him. In front of her warriors, in front of the dying and the dead, she spoke, her voice ringing with formal authority. "Kale the smith," she declared, "you gave me sanctuary when I had none. You mended my shield when I was broken. You stood with me when all others had fallen." She pointed to Garok's body. "He called you a little man, a weak thing. But the strength of a mountain is not in its peak, but in its heart. Your heart is stone and iron. You are not a little man. You are a chieftain in your own right." She strode to him, her movements stiff from her new wound. She took his hand, the calloused, soot-stained hand of a smith, and held it up for all to see. "I am Grusha, daughter of Bor, chieftain of the Iron Tusk clan, and I claim this man as my own. He will stand beside me. He will forge our new law. His home is my home. His people are my people. Any who challenge this, challenge me."
The surviving warriors stared, their expressions a mixture of awe, confusion, and fear. A human, their chieftain's consort. But they had all seen it. They had seen the smith's fire defeat their mighty leader. They had seen this human stand when their own kind had faltered. One by one, they lowered their weapons. One of them, a grizzled old veteran, knelt, then another, and another, until all of Gorok's remaining warriors were kneeling in the dirt and blood of the forge floor, bowing not just to her, but to them, to the new, impossible reality their union represented. The firelight danced on Cale's face. He looked at her, at the kneeling orcs, at the ruins of his quiet life. She was offering him everything, a future, a purpose, a place in the world. But it was her world, not his. He had to make a choice, not as a follower, but as a partner. The dawn that broke over the ruined forge was cold and grey, mirroring the ashes of Cale's former life. The bodies had been dealt with, the wounded tended to as best they could. The forge itself was a wreck, the door a splintered ruin, the floor scarred by molten lead and dark stains of blood. His home, his sanctuary, was gone. Grusha stood in the middle of the devastation, giving quiet orders to her new followers. They were Gorok's warriors no longer. They were hers now, by right of combat and by the sheer force of her will. They obeyed her without question, their earlier aggression replaced by a sullen, wary respect.
They packed supplies, gathered weapons, and prepared to leave.
Cale watched from the doorway, his forging hammer still in his hand. He felt like a ghost in his own life. Grusha had made her grand declaration, had claimed him in front of everyone. The offer was monumental, a place beside her, a role in shaping the future of her clan. It was more than he could ever have imagined. It was also terrifying. She approached him, her movements stiff. He had cleaned and stitched the new wound in her side, his hands surprisingly gentle. She stopped in front of him, her expression unreadable. "We leave within the hour," she said. "We must return to the hold. There is much to be done. Gorok's rot runs deep." Cale looked at her, then at the kneeling warriors, then at the mountains that had been his only companions for so long. He was a smith, a recluse. What place did he have among orc chieftains and warriors? He would be a pet, a curiosity, the little human man the chieftain favoured. His pride, a thing he had not realised he still possessed, bristled at the thought. "I will not be your dependent," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The words surprised him as much as they did her. Her brow furrowed. "You would not be. You would be my consort, honoured." "Honoured?" he snorted, a bitter sound. "I would be a human in an orc world, a smith among warriors. They will not see me as an equal. They will see me as your weakness. And you will have to protect me. I will not be protected, Grusha. I will not be a burden." He saw a flash of anger in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Understanding. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the man who had saved her, but the man who was afraid of being caged, even in a golden cage. "Then what do you want?" she asked, her voice softer now. He took a deep breath. This was it, the moment to choose.
retreat back into his shell, or step forward into a new, uncertain fire. He thought of his old life, the lonely quiet, the weight of his past failures. That life was ash now. He had a choice he had not had in a decade. "I will not stand behind you," he said, meeting her gaze. "I will not stand in your shadow. If I go with you, I go as a partner. I will be Kale the Smith of the Iron Tusk clan. I will have my own forge. I will mend your clan's weapons and armor, and I will teach them what a true, strong blade is. I will not answer to your commanders. I will answer to you, and you will answer to me. We lead together, or I stay here and rebuild." It was an audacious demand. He was a landless human commoner dictating terms to a warrior chieftain. He expected her to laugh, to be insulted. Instead, she was silent for a long moment, her golden eyes searching his face. He did not waver. He held her gaze, his own resolve as hard as the steel he forged. He was not the same man who had opened his door to the storm. That man was gone, burned away in the crucible of the last few days. Finally, a slow smile spread across her face. It was the first true smile he had ever seen from her, and it transformed her features, softening the hard lines and lighting her eyes. "A smith who dictates terms to a chieftain," she murmured, a note of wonder in her voice. "My father would have liked you." She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. She reached out and took the hammer from his hand, her fingers wrapping around his. "Then stand," she said simply. "Stand beside me, Kale the Smith, and we will forge a new law together." He looked down at their joined hands, her large green warrior's hand covering his smaller, calloused human one. It was an impossible pairing, but it felt right. It felt like coming home. "All right," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "All right." The journey to the Iron Tusk hold was hard. Kale faced suspicion and hostility from many of the orcs. They saw him as an outsider, a soft thing. But Grusha's word was law, and his own quiet, unshakable demeanor began to earn a grudging respect. He did not try to be a warrior. He was a smith, and when they saw the first blades he reforged, blades that did not shatter, armor that did not fail, they began to understand his worth. His strength was not in the axe arm, but in the arm that swung the hammer. He was not a warrior, but he was the man who made warriors stronger. He built his new forge in the heart of their mountain stronghold. It was larger than his old one, its fires burning hotter. He worked tirelessly, his hands shaping the future of the clan, one piece of steel at a time. The orcs, who had once mocked him, now came to him with a quiet reverence, seeking not just repairs, but his counsel. He had a wisdom they did not, a patience born of solitude and craft. Months later, Grusha stood before him in the firelight of his new forge. She was to be formally named chieftain in a ceremony at sunrise, solidifying her rule. She was not wearing her rough battle leathers, but a suit of new ceremonial armor he had spent weeks creating. It was his masterpiece, blackened steel inlaid with silver, shaped and molded to her form perfectly. It was beautiful, but it was also functional. Every plate was perfectly tempered, every joint articulated for movement. It was the armor
of a queen. She turned, and he moved to fasten the final piece, the new pauldron that replaced the one that had brought them together. It was a mirror of that first tense night in his old forge. His fingers worked the buckles, the same motions, the same closeness. But everything was different. Then his hands had trembled with fear and uncertainty. Now they were steady, sure. Then her posture was rigid with suspicion. Now she leaned back against him slightly, a gesture of complete trust. His fingers brushed her skin, and this time he did not pull away. He let his hand rest there for a moment, and she did not move. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they had forged, a bond stronger than any steel. "It is good work," she murmured, her voice a low rumble against his chest. "It will hold," he replied. He knew he was not just talking about the armor. He was talking about them, about the improbable future they were building together from the ashes of their old lives. He was no longer a man hiding from the world. He was a man who had found his place in it, not by fighting, but by creating. He had been seen, not for what he was not, but for what he was. A smith, a partner, a chieftain in his own right. He finished the last buckle and stepped back. Grusha, chieftain of the Iron Tusk clan, turned to face him, her golden eyes soft in the firelight. She was no longer the wounded girl from the storm, and he was no longer the lonely smith on the mountain. They had been reforged together in a fire of their own making, and they were stronger for it.